Thank you for clicking in this video. Welcome to a tale where curiosity turns into terror. What starts as a simple game of Ouija with friends spirals into a nightmare that defies all logic. Can the veil between worlds be lifted, or will the darkness consume them? Stay tuned until the end to uncover the chilling conclusion of the curse of the Ouija board. Are you ready to face your fears? Watch now and find out.
I had always been the skeptic in the group. Ghost stories and tales of the supernatural never held much weight with me. My friends, on the other hand, were more open to the unknown. So when Mark suggested we mess around with an old Ouija board he found in his grandmother's attic, I rolled my eyes but went along with it. It was a typical Friday night, and we were looking for something to kill the boredom. We were 5 in total: Mark, the ringleader of this little adventure; Claire, the one always eager for a thrill; Ryan, the most superstitious of us all; Emily, who loved anything spooky; and me, Alex, the one who had better things to do but couldn't resist the peer pressure. Mark set the board on the floor in the center of his dimly lit living room. The air felt thick, as if it were waiting for something. I could see dust dancing in the slivers of moonlight that crept through the curtains. The board itself was old, worn with years, perhaps even decades of age. The letters and numbers were faded, but still legible. A planchette, yellowed with time, rested beside it. "All right, everyone gather around," Mark said, his voice brimming with excitement. "Let's see if we can talk to some spirits. Or just waste our time," I muttered under my breath, though I still found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor opposite him. We all placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, exchanging nervous glances. "Is anyone there?" Mark asked, trying to sound serious but failing to hide the smirk on his face. For a moment, nothing happened. We all sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I felt ridiculous. But then, the planchette started to move. "Are you doing that?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. "No," Mark said, his smirk now gone. I could feel my heart rate pick up as I realized none of us seemed to be in control. The planchette moved slowly but deliberately across the board, stopping at the letter Y. "Yes," Emily whispered, almost to herself. "Who are you?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling slightly. The planchette paused, as if considering the question, before sliding again, this time spelling out a name. "Lucy," I read aloud, a cold shiver running down my spine. The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, creeping closer. "Lucy, do you want to talk to us?" Mark asked, his voice wavering. Again, the planchette moved to yes. "What do you want?" Emily asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. For a moment, the planchette didn't move. We all waited, tension thick in the air, until it finally began to spell out something. "Revenge," it spelled, and my blood ran cold. This was no longer a game. "What the hell is going on?" I said, pulling my hand away from the planchette. The moment my fingers left it, the piece moved faster, more erratic, spelling out words on its own. "Don't leave," it spelled, then quickly moved to "You can't leave." Mark tried to laugh it off. Okay, who's messing with it? This isn't funny." But no one admitted to moving it. In fact, we were all pale, hands trembling. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. I heard Emily scream, then the sound of something crashing to the floor. The lights flickered back on, revealing the board split in two, the planchette on the other side of the room. What the hell just happened? Ryan shouted, backing away from the broken board. We need to get out of here, Claire said, her voice quivering with fear. But as we stood to leave, we heard it, a whisper, so faint it could barely be heard, but unmistakably real. It was a child's voice, soft and cold, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Play with me, it said. My heart pounded in my chest as we all looked at each other, knowing that whatever we had just unleashed was far from done with us. We fled from Mark's house like scared children, the terror gripping us tighter with each step we took. None of us spoke a word as we drove back to our own homes, too shaken by what had just transpired. It wasn't until I was alone in my bedroom that the full weight of what we had done began to sink in. The silence of the night was oppressive, and every creak of the old house made me jump. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a trick, some prank that one of my friends had pulled. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the events over and over. I kept hearing that voice, the whisper of "play with me" echoing in the dark corners of my mind. By morning, I was exhausted, but I tried to push it all away. It was just a stupid game, I told myself, nothing more. The next day, I met up with the others at our usual spot, a rundown diner on the edge of town. Everyone looked as tired and anxious as I felt. We exchanged awkward glances, none of us wanting to be the first to bring up the night before. It was Mark who finally broke the silence. Okay, I think we can all agree that what happened last night was strange, he said, his voice betraying a hint of the fear he was trying to mask. Strange? Ryan scoffed. It was terrifying, man. What the hell was that? I don't know, Mark admitted, but I think we need to figure it out. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us, or maybe we actually made contact with something. I don't want to think about it, Claire said, rubbing her arms as if she could still feel the chill from the night before. We shouldn't have messed with that thing. Agreed, Emily chimed in. I think we should just forget about it and move on. But forgetting wasn't going to be easy. As the days passed, things started to get worse. At first, it was just little things, lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own, a sense of being watched even when no one else was around. But then it escalated. Ryan was the first to experience something truly terrifying. He called me one night, his voice shaking with fear. Alex, something's wrong. I keep hearing things, whispers, footsteps, when no one's there. And I saw something in the mirror. A face, but it wasn't mine. It was a girl with dark eyes. I swear to God, it was her. I tried to calm him down, but his fear was contagious. The more he described what he had seen, the more I felt that same icy dread creeping up my spine. I told him to get some rest and that we'd figure it out in the morning, but I knew neither of us would sleep that night. The next day, Ryan didn't show up at school. When I called him, his phone went straight to voicemail. I felt a growing unease gnawing at my gut, so I decided to stop by his house after classes. His mother answered the door, looking worried. Ryan's been acting strange, she said, wringing her hands. He's been locking himself in his room, won't come out or talk to anyone. I'm really worried about him, Alex. When she let me in, I went upstairs and knocked on his bedroom door. No answer. I called out his name, but all I got in return was silence. Finally, I tried the door. It was unlocked, so I pushed it open. The room was dark, the blinds pulled shut, and the air was stifling. Ryan was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. When he turned to look at me, I could see the terror etched into his expression. "Ryan, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She won't leave me alone, Alex," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's here, in the room. I can feel her watching me. She says it's my turn to play." A cold chill ran through me as I realized that whatever we had summoned wasn't just a figment of our imagination. It was real, and it was after us. I had to get Ryan out of there, but before I could say anything, the room went dark. The light bulb above us shattered, and the temperature dropped sharply. Ryan's eyes widened in terror as he looked past me, at something I couldn't see. "She's here," he gasped. I spun around, but the room was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. But then I heard it, the same whisper I had heard that night at Mark's house, so close it felt like it was right beside me. "Play with me." I rushed out of Ryan's house that day, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Whatever we had awakened was far more than just a bad memory. It was something that wanted to consume us, and it wasn't going to stop. The drive back to my place felt like a blur. Every shadow along the road seemed to twist and reach out, as if the darkness itself was alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. My rational mind told me that it was all in our heads, that we were just scaring ourselves. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the pale, lifeless girl with those dark, hollow eyes. And I could hear it, faint but unmistakable, that soft, chilling whisper, "Play with me." The next day, Mark called a meeting at his place. We all showed up, even Ryan, though he looked worse than ever. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot. He wouldn't meet anyone's gaze, just kept glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting something or someone to appear. "We need to figure out what's going on," Mark said as we gathered in his living room. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a look of deep concern. "This thing is real, and it's coming after us. What do you suggest we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen. There has to be a way to stop it," Claire said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Maybe if we destroy the board." "I already tried that," Mark interrupted, shaking his head. "The board is gone. I threw it into the fireplace last night, watched it burn. But I don't think it mattered." Ryan finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's in my house. She follows me everywhere. I see her in the mirrors, hear her at night. She wants us to play again." "No," I said firmly. "We're not touching that board again. We need to find another way." But deep down, I wasn't sure there was another way. I could feel her presence too. She was always there, lingering just at the edge of my vision, just out of reach but always watching. The fear was starting to eat away at me, gnawing at my sanity. Days turned into a nightmarish blur. None of us could sleep. Every moment of rest was stolen by the overwhelming dread that she was there, waiting. I started seeing her in the most unexpected places, in the reflection of a window, in the corner of my eye while walking down the street, even in my own home. Every time, it was the same, those dark, empty eyes, staring right through me, as if she could see into the deepest parts of my soul. My grades started slipping, and I couldn't focus on anything. My parents noticed, of course, but I couldn't tell them what was really going on. How could I explain that I was being haunted by a spirit we had accidentally unleashed? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. Ryan was the first to crack. He stopped coming to school altogether, locking himself away in his house. None of us could reach him. His mother said he wouldn't even leave his room, and when she tried to go in, he would scream at her to stay away. The whispers had grown louder, he said, and now he could see her, standing in the corner of his room, waiting for him to play. It was Emily who suggested we seek help. She had heard about a local medium, someone who claimed to have experience dealing with spirits. Desperate, we agreed. We met the medium, a woman named Mrs. Donovan, in her small, cluttered house. She was an older woman, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through us. As we sat around her table, she listened patiently to our story. When we were finished, she sighed deeply. "You've unleashed something very old and very dangerous," she said, her voice grave. "Spirits like this one, they latch onto fear, feed on it. The more you fear it, the stronger it becomes. So what do we do?" I asked, feeling a spark of hope. "How do we get rid of it?" Mrs. Donovan looked at each of us in turn, her expression somber. "You can't just get rid of it. Not easily. This spirit, this entity, is bound to you now. But there may be a way to weaken its hold." She explained that we needed to confront our fear, to face the spirit head-on and show it that we weren't afraid. It sounded like a terrible idea, but we had no other options. The alternative was to let it consume us, one by one. As we left Mrs. Donovan's house, the air felt heavier than ever. We were on borrowed time, and deep down, we all knew it. The only question was, who would be the next to break? We all agreed to follow Mrs. Donovan's advice, though none of us really believed it would work. The fear had already taken root deep within us, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. But we had no other choice. We had to try, or else we'd lose our minds, or worse. The plan was simple. We would return to Mark's house, where it all began, and confront the spirit together. Mrs. Donovan had given us each a small amulet, something she said would help protect us from the spirit's influence. It was supposed to ward off evil, to create a barrier between us and the entity. I wasn't sure I believed in it, but I wore mine anyway, desperate for any kind of protection. The night we chose was cold and moonless, the kind of night where the darkness seemed to swallow everything. As I drove to Mark's house, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to run as far as I could, but I forced myself to keep going. This was the only way. When I arrived, the others were already there, waiting on the front porch. Ryan looked like a ghost himself, pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. Mark was pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath, while Claire and Emily huddled together, their faces tense with fear. "Let's just get this over with," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We made our way into the house, the air inside heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. The living room looked exactly as it had the night we played with the Ouija board, but now it felt different. The atmosphere was charged, as if the very walls were watching us. I could feel her presence already, lurking in the shadows, waiting. We sat in a circle in the middle of the room, just like before, with the charred remnants of the Ouija board lying in the fireplace. The flickering light from the flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the silence was deafening. No one wanted to speak, as if breaking the silence would invite her wrath. Mark was the first to try. "We're not afraid of you," he said, though his voice wavered. "We're here to end this." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the temperature in the room began to drop. The fire in the fireplace sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I could hear Ryan breathing heavily beside me, his fear palpable. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. And then we heard it, her voice, soft and mocking, echoing through the room. "Play with me." The sound of it sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. It felt like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. "We're not playing your game," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We're not afraid." But the spirit wasn't fooled. The room began to shake, as if some unseen force was tearing it apart. The windows rattled in their frames, and the furniture creaked and groaned under the pressure. I could feel the presence growing stronger, the air thick with malevolence. Ryan screamed suddenly, clutching his head as if in pain. "She's in my head," he cried, his voice breaking. "She's trying to get in." "Fight it, Ryan!" Mark shouted, but it was no use. Ryan's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor, convulsing violently. We all rushed to his side, but there was nothing we could do. His body was being torn apart by the unseen force, his limbs jerking uncontrollably. "Ryan, no!" Claire sobbed, trying to hold him still. The spirit's laughter filled the room, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in my ears. I could feel her closing in, her presence like a suffocating blanket of darkness. The amulet around my neck grew cold, but it offered no protection, no solace. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the shaking stopped. Ryan lay still on the floor, his breathing ragged. We stared at him in horror, afraid to move, afraid that the spirit was still there, watching us. Is it over?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. But we all knew the answer. This was far from over. We had tried to confront the spirit, to show that we weren't afraid, but it had only made her stronger. She wasn't going to let us go. We were trapped in her game, and there was no way out. I felt a deep, crushing despair settle over me. We had failed. There was no escape from this nightmare. The spirit had claimed Ryan as her first victim, and we all knew it was only a matter of time before she came for the rest of us. As we carried Ryan out of the house that night, the weight of our failure hung heavy in the air. The darkness around us seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that we had only just begun to understand the true horror of what we had unleashed. After that night, everything changed. The fear that had already taken root within us grew exponentially, consuming our every thought, every breath. We had all seen what happened to Ryan, how he had been overtaken by the spirit's malevolent force, and we knew it was just a matter of time before it came for each of us. Ryan didn't return to school. His mother told us that he was bedridden, too weak to move, his mind shattered by whatever the spirit had done to him. We visited him once, but the sight was too much to bear. He was a shell of the person he once was, his eyes empty, his skin pale and clammy. He barely recognized us, mumbling incoherent words about her and the game. We left in silence, each of us grappling with the crushing guilt of what we had brought upon him. Days passed, and the spirit's presence became more pronounced. It wasn't just in our dreams anymore, it followed us in our waking hours, too. I could feel it watching me, a constant weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was as if the air itself had become heavy with her dark energy, suffocating and inescapable. I started hearing whispers, faint at first, but they grew louder each day. They would come to me at the most unexpected times, while I was in class, walking down the street, even when I was at home trying to distract myself with anything that might take my mind off of the terror. The whispers were always the same, a distorted echo of her voice, "Play with me." I stopped sleeping altogether. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by visions of her, her pale face, her empty eyes, the sinister smile that played on her lips as she watched me. I couldn't escape her. She was everywhere. The others were suffering just as much. Mark, who had always been the strong one, the leader of our group, was unraveling. He became paranoid, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows. He started keeping a knife with him at all times, convinced that it would somehow protect him from her. But deep down, we all knew that there was no protection against something like this. Claire and Emily tried to stick together, but even their friendship wasn't enough to stave off the fear. They were constantly on edge, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. Claire stopped going to classes, and Emily began to withdraw, barely speaking to anyone. It was like the spirit was slowly breaking us down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. The soft, insistent creak of floorboards, like someone was walking down the hallway outside my room. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, every muscle in my body tensed with fear. The sound grew closer until it stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, praying that it was just my imagination, that the door wouldn't open. But then the handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by terror. The door creaked open, and I saw her, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, barely visible in the darkness. Her outline was distorted, like she was not entirely part of this world. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching me, her presence filling the room with an oppressive, suffocating fear. And then, in a voice that was both distant and close, she whispered, "Play with me." I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from my bed, rushing past her and out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I could still feel her presence, even then, lingering just behind me, watching, waiting. I spent the rest of the night driving aimlessly, trying to escape the fear that clung to me like a second skin. But no matter how far I drove, no matter how fast, I couldn't outrun it. She was with me, always. The next day, I knew something had to change. We couldn't go on like this, living in constant fear, waiting for her to take us one by one. We needed to find a way to end this once and for all. I called the others, and we agreed to meet at my place. It was time to figure out what to do next, how to stop this nightmare from consuming us entirely. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. The spirit had already taken hold of us, and she wasn't going to let go without a fight. When they arrived, we sat in my living room, the tension between us thick and heavy. No one spoke at first, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own fears. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "We can't keep living like this," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have to find a way to stop her." "But how?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "We tried everything. She's too strong." "I don't know," Mark admitted, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But we have to try something." Emily looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "Maybe we need to go back to Mrs. Donovan. She might know something else, something we haven't tried." I nodded, though I wasn't sure it would help. Mrs. Donovan had already given us her best advice, and it had only made things worse. But we had no other options. "We'll go tomorrow," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe she can help us find a way to end this." As the night wore on, we all stayed at my place, too afraid to be alone. But even together, the fear was overwhelming. I could feel her presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew, deep down, that our time was running out. The spirit was growing stronger with each passing day, feeding on our fear, our despair. And unless we found a way to stop her, it was only a matter of time before she claimed us all. The next morning, we drove to Mrs. Donovan's house, each of us gripped by a sense of dread that had become all too familiar. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, as if the world itself had grown darker with the weight of our fear. The once comforting light of day had lost its power to chase away the nightmares that haunted us. When we arrived, Mrs. Donovan was waiting for us on her porch, as if she had known we were coming. Her face was etched with worry, the lines around her eyes deepening as she took in our haggard appearances. She didn't say a word as we approached, but the look in her eyes told us that she knew things had only gotten worse. We followed her inside, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. Her home, which had once felt warm and welcoming, now seemed cold and foreboding. The walls, covered in faded floral wallpaper, seemed to close in around us as we made our way to the living room. The air was thick with the scent of incense, but it did little to mask the underlying stench of decay that seemed to permeate the house. "Tell me what happened," Mrs. Donovan said once we were seated. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a tension that hadn't been there before. We took turns recounting the events of the past few days, the escalating terror, Ryan's descent into madness, the spirit's relentless pursuit of us. As we spoke, Mrs. Donovan listened intently, her expression growing more troubled with each word. When we finished, she let out a long, slow breath, as if the weight of our story had settled heavily upon her shoulders. "I feared this might happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The spirit you've awakened is not just any ghost. She's something far more dangerous, far more malevolent." We exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of our situation sinking in even deeper. I had hoped, foolishly, that she might have some simple solution, some ritual or incantation that would banish the spirit for good. But it was clear now that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. "What can we do?" Mark asked, his voice strained with desperation. Mrs. Donovan looked at us, her eyes filled with sorrow. "There may be a way to send her back, but it's dangerous, more dangerous than anything you've faced so far." Claire's voice trembled as she asked, "What do we have to do?" Mrs. Donovan hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to tell us. Finally, she spoke, her voice grave. "The spirit was bound to the tabula Ouija when you first summoned her. To send her back, you must perform a binding ritual, one that will trap her within the board once more." Relief washed over us at the thought that there might be a way to end this nightmare. But that relief was short-lived as Mrs. Donovan continued. "The ritual requires a sacrifice," she said, her voice heavy with the burden of what she was about to reveal. "One of you must willingly offer your life to bind the spirit. Only then can the ritual be completed." A stunned silence fell over the room as we processed her words. The idea of sacrificing one of our own was unthinkable, yet the reality of our situation left us with no other options. The spirit would not stop until she had taken us all, and even then, she might continue to torment others. Mark was the first to speak, his voice low and resolute. "I'll do it." "No," Claire whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "We can't let you." "It has to be someone," Mark said, cutting her off. "And I'm the one who started this. It's only right that I be the one to end it." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There has to be another way." "There has to be." "There isn't," Mrs. Donovan said quietly. "I wish there were, but this is the only way to save the rest of you." The room fell silent once more as the gravity of what Mark was proposing sank in. None of us wanted to accept it, but deep down, we knew he was right. One life in exchange for the others, it was a terrible choice, but it was the only one we had. After what felt like an eternity, Mark stood up, his expression calm and determined. "Tell me what I have to do," he said to Mrs. Donovan. She nodded and began to explain the ritual, her voice steady but somber. The steps were intricate, requiring precision and focus, but Mark listened intently, absorbing every detail. The rest of us could only watch in helpless silence, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on us like a physical force. When Mrs. Donovan finished, Mark turned to us, his gaze steady. "I need you all to be there with me," he said. "I can't do this alone." We nodded, too choked with emotion to speak. The thought of losing Mark was unbearable, but we knew that he was right. If we didn't do this, we would all be lost. The ritual was to take place that night, at the exact hour when we had first summoned the spirit. Mrs. Donovan gave us the necessary items, candles, herbs, and a special knife used for the sacrifice. The atmosphere was thick with tension as we made our way to the place where it all began, Mark's basement, where the cursed tabula Ouija still lay. As we descended the stairs, the darkness seemed to close in around us, the air growing colder with each step. I could feel the spirit's presence, stronger than ever, as if she knew what we were planning. She was angry, furious, and the fear that gripped me was almost suffocating. Mark set up the ritual space in the center of the basement, carefully following Mrs. Donovan's instructions. We stood around him in a circle, our hands trembling as we held the candles, their flames flickering in the cold, stale air. When everything was in place, Mark knelt before the tabula Ouija, the knife in his hand. He looked up at us, his expression resolute. "No matter what happens, don't stop the ritual," he said. "Promise me." We nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down our faces. The reality of what was about to happen was almost too much to bear. Mark took a deep breath and began the incantation, his voice steady and clear despite the terror that hung in the air. The words, though unfamiliar, seemed to resonate in the room, their power growing with each syllable. As he spoke, the spirit's presence intensified, the temperature plummeting until our breath hung in the air in white puffs. The candles flickered wildly, their flames struggling against the oppressive darkness that surrounded us. Then, without warning, the spirit appeared, her form materializing out of the shadows, more terrifying than ever before. Her eyes were wild with rage, her mouth twisted into a snarl as she lunged toward Mark. But he didn't stop. He kept chanting, his voice growing louder, more insistent, as he raised the knife above his head. The spirit shrieked, a sound so piercing that it felt like it would tear our minds apart. She lashed out, her fury palpable, but there was nothing she could do to stop what was happening. With one swift motion, Mark brought the knife down, plunging it into his own chest. Blood poured from the wound, staining the tabula Ouija as he continued the incantation, his voice growing weaker with each word. The spirit let out one final, ear-splitting scream as she was drawn back into the board, her form twisting and contorting as she fought against the binding force. But it was too late, the ritual was complete. The room fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting as the spirit was finally banished. But there was no relief, no sense of victory, only the crushing grief of what we had just witnessed. Mark collapsed to the floor, his eyes already glazing over as the life drained from him. We rushed to his side, but there was nothing we could do. His sacrifice had saved us, but the cost was too high. We stayed with him until the very end, holding his hand as he took his final breaths. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of our guilt and sorrow too much to bear. As dawn broke, we finally left the basement, leaving behind the cursed tabula Ouija and the memories of the horrors we had unleashed. We were alive, but we would never be the same. And as we stepped out into the light of day, we knew that we would carry the scars of that night for the rest of our lives. The days that followed Mark's death were a blur of numbness and grief. We didn't speak much, each of us retreating into our own private hells. The reality of what had happened, what we had lost, was too overwhelming to confront all at once. We had gone to hell and back, and while the spirit had been banished, it felt as though a part of her darkness had stayed with us, infecting our souls. Funeral arrangements were made, and Mark's family, who had been kept in the dark about the true nature of his death, believed the story we told them, that he had died in a tragic accident. It was easier that way, easier for them, and easier for us. The truth was too horrific to bear, and we didn't want to burden anyone else with the knowledge of what we had done. The day of the funeral was overcast, the sky heavy with the threat of rain. It felt like the world was mourning with us, its light dimmed by the weight of our sorrow. We stood together at the gravesite, the four of us huddled close as Mark's casket was lowered into the ground. The priest spoke of peace and eternal rest, but his words rang hollow in the face of our guilt. As the first shovelfuls of dirt hit the casket, I felt a cold wind whip through the cemetery, cutting through my jacket and chilling me to the bone. It was a bitter reminder that, while the spirit was gone, something in me had changed forever. We had survived, but we had not escaped unscathed. After the funeral, we tried to return to our lives, but nothing felt normal anymore. School, friends, even our own families, everything seemed distant, disconnected from the reality we had faced. The bond we had shared as friends, once strong and unbreakable, now felt strained under the weight of our shared trauma. I found myself avoiding the others, unable to bear the reminder of what we had gone through. Emily and Claire were grieving deeply, and while they tried to reach out to me, I kept my distance. I couldn't face them, couldn't face the pain that was reflected in their eyes, the same pain I saw every time I looked in the mirror. It was Mark's absence that haunted me the most. His sacrifice, his final act of bravery, had saved us all, and yet it felt like we had failed him. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my mind, wondering if there was something we could have done differently, something that might have spared his life. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that basement, watching as Mark drove the knife into his chest, hearing the spirit's final scream as she was banished back to the board. The guilt gnawed at me, a relentless presence that refused to let me rest. I was afraid that if I let my guard down, the darkness would consume me completely. The nightmares came every night, vivid and unrelenting. I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the echoes of Mark's death cry still ringing in my ears. It felt like the spirit had left a part of herself inside me, a piece of her malevolence that continued to torment me even after she was gone. One night, as I lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of my nightmares. But as the whisper grew louder, more insistent, I realized with a jolt of terror that it was real. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but it carried a sinister edge that sent chills down my spine. It was calling my name, beckoning me with a calm yet commanding tone that made my blood run cold. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there, nothing but the darkness of my room. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the voice continued, whispering in the darkness, growing louder with each passing night. It spoke of things I didn't want to hear, secrets I had buried deep inside, fears I had tried to forget. I started to see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that moved on their own, fleeting glimpses of a figure that disappeared the moment I turned to look. It was as if the spirit, though banished, had left an imprint on me, a lingering presence that refused to let me go. I was losing my grip on reality, spiraling deeper into the darkness that had claimed my friend. My thoughts became increasingly paranoid, consumed by the belief that the spirit was still with me, watching, waiting for the moment to strike. I could feel her cold breath on the back of my neck, hear her whispering in my ear even in the daylight. The others noticed the change in me, but I pushed them away, refusing their attempts to help. I couldn't bring myself to talk about what I was experiencing, afraid that acknowledging it would make it real. I was alone in my terror, trapped in a waking nightmare with no escape. Weeks passed, and the voice became a constant presence, its whispers turning into commands. It urged me to return to the tabula Ouija, to complete what had been started. It wanted me to finish the ritual, to sacrifice something more, but I didn't understand what it meant. One night, the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was screaming inside my head. I couldn't take it anymore, the relentless noise, the overwhelming fear. In a moment of desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the tabula Ouija from its hiding place and threw it into the fire. The flames roared to life, consuming the board with an intensity that was almost unnatural. I watched as the wood blackened and cracked, the planchette melting into a pool of molten plastic. The room filled with acrid smoke, but I didn't care. I wanted it gone, needed it gone. But even as the tabula Ouija burned, the voice didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, angrier, as if I had only made things worse. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and twist, taking on shapes that defied explanation. And then, as the last of the board turned to ash, the voice went silent. The room was suddenly still, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as quickly as it had descended. For a moment, I dared to hope that it was over, that I had finally freed myself from the curse. But deep down, I knew better. The spirit may have been banished, the tabula Ouija may have been destroyed, but the darkness it had brought into my life was far from gone. It was a part of me now, a shadow that I would carry with me forever. And as I stood there in the dim light of the dying fire, I realized the truth. I would never truly escape the horrors we had unleashed. The spirit had taken Mark, but she had left something behind, an indelible mark on my soul that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Time moved in strange ways after I destroyed the Ouija board. Days blurred into nights, and weeks passed without any real sense of time. I became a shell of my former self, drifting through the motions of daily life with a numb detachment that frightened even me. The voice had gone silent, but the shadows it left behind lingered, haunting my every thought. The others tried to reach out to me, but I pushed them away, retreating further into my isolation. I couldn't bear to be around them, couldn't face the reminders of what we had done, what we had lost. Emily, Claire, and Alex, they were all suffering too, but I was too consumed by my own fear and guilt to offer them any comfort. Nights were the worst. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of that terrible night replaying over and over in my mind. The darkness seemed to close in on me, oppressive and suffocating, and I would lie awake for hours, staring into the void, waiting for the next nightmare to begin. During the day, I avoided anything that reminded me of the Ouija board. I stayed away from the basement, barely able to look at the door without feeling a cold shiver of dread. I refused to talk about what had happened, even when the others tried to bring it up. It was easier to pretend that it was all a bad dream, something that would fade with time. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The truth was, I was haunted. Not by the spirit we had banished, but by the fear that it had left behind. It was as if the darkness had seeped into my very being, staining me with its malevolence. I couldn't escape it, couldn't outrun it. No matter how hard I tried, it was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to drag me back into the nightmare. One evening, as I sat alone in my room, staring blankly at the wall, I felt a sudden urge to reach out to the others. I didn't know why, but I needed to see them, needed to know that they were okay. The distance I had put between us was suffocating, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of something other than fear, a desperate need for connection. I picked up my phone and dialed Emily's number. The phone rang once, twice, and then her voice came on the line, hesitant and filled with a pain that mirrored my own. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. "Hey," she replied softly. There was a long pause, and then she asked, "How are you?" I didn't know how to answer that. I wasn't sure if I could even put into words what I was feeling. "I'm surviving," I finally said. It was the closest thing to the truth I could manage. "We all are," Emily said, her voice cracking slightly. "It's been hard." "Yeah," I agreed, unable to say anything more. There was another long silence, and then I asked, Have you been hearing anything? Seeing anything?" Emily hesitated before answering. "No, not really. But I feel it, you know? Like something's still there, watching." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Me too. I miss him," she whispered. "I miss Mark so much." "Me too," I repeated, my chest tightening with grief. "Every day." We talked for a while longer, our conversation circling around the same dark thoughts and fears. It didn't make the pain go away, but it helped to know that I wasn't alone in this, that we were all struggling to find our way through the darkness. After I hung up, I felt a little lighter, as if some of the weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance, more vivid and terrifying than ever before. In the dream, I was back in the basement, standing over Mark's lifeless body. The spirit was there too, her eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to sear into my soul. She whispered my name, her voice echoing in the empty room, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, pulling me down into the darkness. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. But even in the dim light, I could see them, shadows moving across the walls, twisting and writhing like something alive. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming, but the cold sweat on my skin and the rapid thud of my heartbeat told me otherwise. The shadows were real, and they were coming for me. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled out of bed, backing away from the walls as the shadows closed in. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, growing darker and more menacing with each passing second. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, choked by fear. I could feel the cold breath of the spirit on my neck, hear her whispering my name over and over, each repetition more insistent, more demanding. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows vanished. The room was still and silent once more, the only sound my ragged breathing. But I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The spirit may have been banished, but the darkness she had brought into my life was far from gone. The fear was back, stronger than ever, and I knew that there was no escaping it. I was trapped in a waking nightmare, one that I couldn't run from or hide from. The only thing I could do was face it, whatever it was that was coming for me. But as I sat there in the darkness, my body trembling with fear, I couldn't help but wonder if I had the strength to do so. The spirit had taken Mark, and now she was coming for me. And I was terrified that this time, there would be no escape. The days that followed the nightmare were a blur of anxiety and dread. I could no longer tell where the darkness ended and my reality began. The boundaries of my world had become dangerously thin, and I was teetering on the edge of sanity. The nights were the worst. Each time I closed my eyes, the darkness of the dream world seemed to seep into reality. I would lie in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, too terrified to move. The shadows continued their dance on the walls, their presence a constant reminder that I was not alone. During the day, I attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy. I went to school, met with friends, and even tried to smile. But the effort was exhausting, and the fear never truly left me. It hovered just below the surface, ready to erupt at the slightest provocation. One evening, as I was walking home from school, I noticed a figure in the distance, standing beneath a street lamp. The light cast a long shadow, and for a moment, I could have sworn it looked like a familiar face. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. The figure seemed to watch me, unmoving and silent. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I walked closer, the figure remained stationary, its gaze unblinking. I quickened my pace, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The figure disappeared as I rounded the corner, but the unease lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows in my room seemed to take on more defined shapes, moving with a deliberate and menacing purpose. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself that it was just my mind making things up, but the fear was overwhelming. The whispers began again, faint at first, then growing louder and more insistent. They called my name, pleading with me, demanding something I couldn't quite understand. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on me, a palpable force that threatened to crush me. Desperate for relief, I decided to visit Emily. I hadn't seen her in weeks, but I needed to know if she was experiencing the same things I was. Maybe we could find some answers together, find a way to end this nightmare. When I arrived at her house, it was eerily quiet. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, more urgently this time, my anxiety rising with each unanswered call. Finally, Emily's mother opened the door, her face etched with concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her gaze shifting to the darkness of the street behind me. "I need to see Emily," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's important." Emily's mother hesitated before nodding. "She's been having a hard time lately," she said quietly. "I'll call her." A few minutes later, Emily appeared at the door, her face pale and drawn. The moment she saw me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping outside. "I've been having nightmares," I confessed, my voice trembling. "The shadows, the whispers, they won't stop. I needed to see you. Are you experiencing anything like this?" Emily nodded slowly, her expression troubled. "Yes. I thought I was going crazy. The whispers, the shadows, they've been following me too." We talked for hours, our conversation filled with the sheer horror of our experiences. Emily told me that she had been seeing the same figure I had seen under the street lamp, a dark silhouette that seemed to watch her every move. She had also heard the whispers, a constant, unsettling presence in her mind. As we spoke, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we weren't alone in this. Maybe we could find a way to stop it. But as the night wore on, the fear began to creep back in. The darkness seemed to close in around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Emily suggested that we try to find out more about the Ouija board, to understand what we had unleashed. We spent hours researching, digging through old books and online forums, looking for any information that might explain our situation. What we found only deepened our dread. The Ouija board, we discovered, was not just a game. It was a tool used in ancient times to communicate with the dead, and it was said to open a portal to the spirit world. The more we read, the more we realized that we had unleashed something far beyond our understanding. The spirit we had encountered was no ordinary ghost. It was a vengeful entity, bound by anger and hatred, seeking to cause as much suffering as possible. The whispers, the shadows, the nightmares, they were all part of its attempt to reclaim the power it had lost. We knew we had to act quickly. The longer we waited, the stronger the spirit would become. We made a plan to confront the entity, to try to close the portal we had inadvertently opened. It was a desperate measure, but it was the only option we had left. As we prepared for the ritual, a deep sense of foreboding settled over me. The spirit was not done with us yet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it came for us again. The fear was palpable, a living entity that seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. Emily and I gathered the necessary items for the ritual, a circle of salt, candles, and protective symbols. We performed the ritual as best as we could, our hands trembling with fear and anticipation. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to dance around us, mocking our efforts. As we completed the final incantation, the room was filled with an oppressive silence. For a moment, I thought we had succeeded, that we had finally rid ourselves of the spirit's influence. But then, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. The spirit was still with us, its presence more powerful than ever. We had only succeeded in making it angrier, and now it was determined to make us pay for our interference. The encounter with the shadowy figure left me shaken, but the true horror of it came later that night. As I lay in bed, attempting to banish the unsettling image from my mind, I noticed that my bedroom seemed different, darker, colder. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, moving with a life of their own. The whispers began again, this time more insistent and pervasive. They were not just in my dreams anymore, but seemed to be a constant presence, a low murmur that followed me throughout the day. The voice was always just out of reach, too faint to understand clearly, but always there, a chilling reminder of my entrapment. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and I began to notice changes in myself. My reflection in the mirror seemed off, as though someone or something else was looking back at me. My eyes looked hollow, my skin pale and drawn. I was becoming a ghost of my former self, and the fear was starting to eat away at my sanity. One night, in a desperate attempt to find some semblance of peace, I decided to confront the darkness directly. I took a flashlight and ventured down to the basement, the place where it had all started. The air was cold and still, and the basement, now a haunting relic of that fateful night, seemed to close in on me. I stood before the spot where we had used the Ouija board, the floor still stained with the remnants of our ritual. The shadows danced across the walls, stretching and distorting as if mocking me. I took a deep breath and spoke aloud, my voice trembling with fear. "I know you're here," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What do you want from me?" The basement was silent for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I had been imagining it all. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was calling my name, soft and mournful, like a distant echo from another world. My heart pounded in my chest, and I shined the flashlight around, searching for the source of the voice. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the old wooden walls and cobwebs that seemed to come alive under its glow. I saw nothing but the familiar, yet everything felt foreign and menacing. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, sending a jolt of terror through me. I turned, but there was no one there, just the oppressive silence of the basement. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, the fear threatening to overwhelm me. I stumbled back up the stairs, the darkness seeming to close in behind me. My breathing was ragged, my mind racing with thoughts of the spirit that had tormented us. I wanted to believe that it was over, that the spirit had been banished, but the evidence of its lingering presence was undeniable. Back in my room, I locked the door and huddled under my covers, trying to block out the whispers that continued to echo in my mind. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the moment to strike. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, clutching a photograph of Mark. It was the last image I had of him, a smiling picture taken just before the fateful night. His eyes seemed to follow me, a haunting reminder of what we had lost. As I stared at the photograph, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could almost make out the words now, though they were still distorted and fragmented. It was as if the spirit was trying to communicate, trying to tell me something that I couldn't quite understand. In a fit of frustration and fear, I threw the photograph against the wall, shattering the frame. The image of Mark lay on the floor, the glass cracked and broken. I fell back onto the bed, feeling utterly defeated. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing fear. The silence was too profound, too complete. It felt like the calm before a storm, and I knew that whatever was coming next would be far worse than anything I had faced before. In the quiet of the night, I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. The line between the real world and the supernatural had become dangerously thin, and I couldn't tell if I was truly experiencing these horrors or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The fear had become a constant companion, lurking in the corners of my mind, ready to pounce at the slightest provocation. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself sinking deeper into despair. The whispers continued, growing more frantic and demanding. They seemed to be urging me to do something, but I couldn't decipher their message. The more I tried to ignore them, the louder and more insistent they became. The darkness that had once been confined to the basement now seemed to follow me everywhere. It was in the streets, in the school hallways, even in my own home. I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, and I couldn't see a way out. The more I struggled, the more I felt like I was losing control. My friends noticed the change in me, but I pushed them away, unable to explain what was happening. I was afraid that if I let anyone in, they would see how broken I had become. As I sat alone in my room, the shadows stretching across the walls, I couldn't help but feel that I was on the brink of something terrible. The spirit had left a mark on me, and now it was waiting for its chance to strike. The fear was all-consuming, and I knew that if I didn't find a way to confront it, it would devour me completely. As the final days dragged on, the oppressive atmosphere in my life reached a breaking point. I felt like a puppet on a string, my movements dictated by the unseen force that had taken hold of me. The whispers had become more coherent, more demanding, their urgency mounting with each passing day. Desperation drove me to seek answers. I spent countless hours researching the Ouija board and its dark history, hoping to find a solution that would end my suffering. But the more I learned, the more hopeless I felt. The stories of those who had faced similar horrors all ended in tragedy, and I couldn't escape the feeling that my fate was sealed. One night, as I sat alone in my room, the shadows seemed to gather around me, their presence more oppressive than ever. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel a cold, malevolent presence closing in on me. I knew it was time to confront whatever was tormenting me. I gathered what little courage I had left and decided to return to the basement. The very place where it had all begun, where the darkness had first seeped into my life, seemed like the only place where I could confront the spirit. I took a flashlight and descended the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness. The basement was eerily silent, and for a moment, I thought that maybe, just maybe, the darkness had finally receded. But then I saw it, the shadowy figure standing in the corner, its form shifting and changing as if it were made of pure darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to come closer. I took a deep breath and approached the figure, trying to steady my trembling hands. "I know you're here," I said, my voice quivering with fear. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't move, but the whispers became clearer, more distinct. They seemed to form words, though they were still fragmented and distorted. "You must pay." The voice was chilling, filled with an anger and resentment that seemed to pierce through my very soul. I felt a wave of cold panic wash over me, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Pay for what?" I demanded. What do you want? The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and I felt a cold wind whip through the basement. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, coherent message. You must release me. It took a moment for the meaning to sink in. The spirit wasn't just tormenting me for the sake of it. It was trapped, bound to the world by something we had done. We had unleashed it, and now it was demanding its freedom. I knew I had to do something, but what? I didn't have any answers, only fear and desperation. I searched through my memories, trying to recall anything that might help. And then it hit me, the Ouija board. We had used it to communicate with the spirit, to try and understand its presence. Maybe, just maybe, if I used it again, I could find a way to set it free. I raced back upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I retrieved the remnants of the Ouija board from where I had hidden them, and with trembling hands, I set them up in the basement. The once cracked planchette was now barely recognizable, but I placed it on the board, hoping against hope that it would still work. I took a deep breath and placed my hands on the planchette, trying to calm my racing mind. If there's anyone here, I said, please, help me understand how to release you. How can I set you free? The planchette moved slowly at first, as if reluctant to cooperate. Then, it began to spell out words, each letter coming with a jolt of energy that seemed to pass through my entire body. Find the truth. Find the truth? I repeated, confused. What truth? The planchette continued its eerie dance, spelling out a name, Margaret. The name echoed in my mind, and I realized that I had heard it before. It was the name of the spirit we had accidentally released, the one that had caused so much pain and suffering. I knew I had to do something with this new information, but what? I had no idea where to start or how to find Margaret. I had to rely on my instincts and the scraps of knowledge I had gathered. I decided to visit the old library where we had first learned about the Ouija board, hoping that it might hold some clue to Margaret's past. The library was quiet and empty, the shadows cast by the dim lights creating an eerie atmosphere. I searched through the old records and books, feeling a sense of urgency. After hours of digging, I found a dusty old journal that mentioned a woman named Margaret who had died under mysterious circumstances decades ago. The journal described how Margaret had been accused of witchcraft and executed, her spirit restless and vengeful. The records detailed the dark history of her death and the curse that had been placed upon her. I realized with horror that the spirit we had unleashed was bound by this curse, and that it had been waiting for a chance to be set free. Armed with this new knowledge, I returned to the basement. The shadows were still there, but they seemed to be less menacing, more subdued. I knew that I had to break the curse to release Margaret's spirit and put an end to the torment. I performed a ritual of release that I had found in the journal, hoping that it would be enough to break the curse and set Margaret free. As I recited the words, I felt a heavy weight lift from the room. The whispers grew quieter, and the shadows seemed to recede, leaving the basement bathed in an uneasy calm. I sat down, exhausted and emotionally drained. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The darkness that had consumed my life seemed to be fading, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. The next few days were quiet. The whispers had stopped, and the shadows no longer haunted my every step. I began to slowly rebuild my life, reconnecting with friends and family, trying to piece together the fragments of normalcy that had been shattered. As I looked back on everything that had happened, I realized that the true horror of the experience was not just the spirit or the darkness that had followed me, but the fear and isolation I had felt. It had been a test of strength and courage, and though I had survived, the scars would remain. In the end, I had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. The whispers, the shadows, and the fear had left their mark, and I knew that I would never be the same again. But as I looked out at the world, I felt a renewed sense of hope. The darkness had been vanquished, and though the scars would always be there, I was determined to live my life to the fullest, knowing that I had faced the terror and survived.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.